Janice, welcome to the IMC.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here. There is an additional idea in being physically present since you actually get to taste stuff. Even though the theme is about virtual and augmented flavors, I look forward to hear more about what that is. So Janice is an assistant professor here at Aarhus University at the Department of Food Science, and has had a very interesting trajectory through academia, starting out at Caltech in computer science. And then she went to MIT Media Lab and did whatever they do at MIT Media Lab, which is definitely interesting.
Thank you for saying that.
And then she went to Oxford and did a PhD in experimental psychology with Charles Spence.
Yes.
For those of you who don't know Charles Spence, he is kind of one of the leading experts in the world on the psychology of taste and also on how different modalities affect why things might taste differently under some circumstances than in other circumstances.
Wow.
Which is also what we'll be hearing about today.
Yes.
Now, Janice is also an expert wine taster.
I'm sorry there's no wine
She runs experiments on wine as well. If you find her at other times, they can be highly recommended.
Yes.
And a pastry chef, I guess, as well. But
you really looked up my CV.
Oh, only the interesting things. Anyway, Janice, we're glad to have you here. Please take us away.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, everyone who can be here in person. Like Andreas said, those of you who are here can enjoy the chocolate as I try to bribe my listeners. And those of you who are online, hopefully you have some chocolate with you. So, as Andreas was saying, I'm a tenure-track assistant professor here at AU, but in the Department of Food Science. When I first came to Denmark 3 years ago, we were on Fyn, kind of all the way in the countryside in Oslo, and it was only 2 years ago that we moved to Skyview, which is closer to here. And of course, right after we moved, the lockdown started. So it's only now that I'm starting to meet the people who's actually on campus. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I've heard about the IMC since forever, and I'm so happy that I can be here and talk to you guys. And actually, as Andreas mentioned, I did my PhD at Oxford in the CROSSMODAL research laboratory, and this was in experimental psychology. And really, the research wasn't just about food. The research was about all aspects of life and experiences, and how different sensor modalities can interact and influence each other. I happened to specialize in taste and actually in how sound influences taste perception. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But my research in general, actually I have it on the next slide. So I thought I would introduce my research agenda in a more broad scope by focusing on 3 questions that I'm really interested in. And the first one is, how do people make sense of the world around them? And as you will see later from my talk, I like to study food and eating and flavor because I think it's a really good way to study multisensory integration. And there you have a picture of me with a VR headset, which I will talk more about later. The second question is, what can the chemical senses tell us? And here you have a picture from the Oxford-Cambridge blind tasting varsity match, because Oxford and Cambridge kind of like to compete in everything, including blind tasting. And when I was there, I was the captain of the Oxford team for 2 years, and we beat Cambridge every time. But the point here is, because I come from this background of blind wine tasting, and I'm also a wine judge on different wine competitions, I have this personal experience that people are actually able to derive a lot of knowledge from what they smell and what they taste. Because in standard psychology, people tend to think that what's really interesting to study is vision and hearing. And I personally feel like I'm on a crusade to make people realize that what they smell and what they taste is actually very interesting, both from an emotional, experiential perspective, but also from an epistemological perspective of what kind of abstract knowledge we can derive. And maybe if you come to my wine tasting at IS next year, you can learn more about that. And finally, because I also have a computer science background, I'm very interested in the intersection between the digital world and the physical world. And here I have the question of, how does the digital world impact our physical reality? One of my PhD students, who has both hands working, not here, Jack Anderson, is doing his PhD. Oh, okay. Andreas, you need to mute here. iPad. One of my PhD students is working on food porn on Instagram and what happens to our actual satiety when people look at digital food images. So that's a brief overview, but today I'm talking about this very catchy title of augmented and virtual flavors. And maybe it's so catchy, and that's how I got the Carlsberg Young Researcher Fellowship on this subject. And I will be talking about some of the studies that was conducted in this project, some of the studies that led to me writing the project, and because I still have 2 more years to go on the project, maybe some directions, and I would love to have a discussion about what else can we do around this overall topic. Because this is really basically talking about, illusions and what kind of illusions that we can experience through what we eat. Okay, so today I have 3 overall themes. The first one is more, say, classic sensory science to show what is flavor perception as most people normally would study it, and how even classic flavor perception is really an example of multisensory integration. The second overall heading is flavor illusions, and really that flavor illusions are normal, and that's actually a common occurrence. And the third topic, and this is one I'm working on at the moment, is to take an extended reality framework, and this is where the virtual reality and augmented reality comes in. How can we study flavor and experience on this digital physical spectrum? And we'll talk more about that. Okay, so the first topic, flavor is multisensory, and here I have an image of the 5 classic sensory modalities, and that's just to say that eating is actually quite complicated. Maybe I just use my hands here. So whenever we talk about food and eating, one thing to keep in mind is that the sensory perception is not just based on, say, taste or just based on smell, and this is why I have the chocolate here, we'll experience later. When we experience flavor, it's actually quite a complicated process. We can both approach it from bottom up, where we get the sensations we perceive first, and that builds into awareness. But we also have a top-down process where the sensory perceptions that we get are influenced by things like our prior knowledge, by memory, by expertise. And what's very interesting about eating, and that's with everything else, is how the top-down process and the bottom-up process can integrate together to form our own unique individual flavor experiences. So, Andreas, I know that you heard all about this at the Thinking About Senses symposium that you were organizing, and we had many discussions on what exactly is flavor and what kind of sensory modalities constitute flavor. So on a most basic way of thinking, when you talk about flavor, most people think about the tongue and taste. So we have these so-called basic tastes that we perceive only on the tongue, and these are things like sweet, sour, salty, umami, and bitter. Of course, it's not just only 5 tastes that we perceive on the tongue. Recent research has shown other potential taste qualities, especially fat, metal. Kokumi is the new trendy one, and even water could be considered as a basic taste. And I include the tongue map on the left because in a more old-fashioned textbook, you might see something like, here's the tongue map, and we only perceive sweet on the tip and we only perceive bitter on the back. Well, that's not correct. We actually perceive all tastes everywhere on the tongue. It's just that the different taste receptors are not uniformly distributed, so that we might, it might be easier to perceive sourness, for example, on the side, but it's not the only place. And then it comes to smell. And according to my PhD supervisor, Charles Spence, smell is something like 70 or 80% of flavor, but really there's no study that has actually shown this. But what we do see is, for example, after COVID, smell loss is one of the major symptoms, and many people will complain that they've lost their sense of taste, when in reality they can still taste. If you put taste drops on their tongue, they can perceive the taste. What they have actually lost is smell. But in our everyday eating experience, we're so used to mixing smell and taste together in the mouth that we make this mistaken assumption that because we can't smell, we can't taste. And I just want to say that there's actually two different types of smelling. There's orthonasal olfaction, which is when we breathe in, so when the air is coming into the nose. So if you're breathing in your coffee, for example, you get that smell, and that's orthonasal. But when we're eating, we also get smell via retronasal olfaction, and actually we perceive the smell when we're breathing out. This is something that I always find interesting, that the direction of airflow actually determines whether it's ortho or retronasal. And as we'll see later, this retronasal olfaction of when the food is in the mouth and we breathe out, and the chemicals in the food are volatilized up through the back of the throat and then through the nasal cavity to the olfactory epithelium through this backwards channel. And this is where we get most of our smell perception, in the back of the throat. And finally, if we're just purely sticking to what we perceive to be in the mouth, mouthfeel is also a very important part of food perception, and for me, flavor. And here we have the trigeminal nerves at work, and the trigeminal nerves are detecting two things. One is touch, so for example, food textures like creamy, foamy, crunchy, slippery, sticky, etc. My PhD student Francisco here is very interested in mouthfeel and touch. And the trigeminal nerves are also responsible for detecting pain. And in terms of food, this could translate to temperature detection of whether the food is hot or cold. This could also be, for example, burning sensations, like if you're eating a chili or eating ginger, or cooling sensations, for example, menthol. So we have these already three senses at work in the mouth. We have smell, taste, and touch. And I just want to show one example of these so-called illusion, or an example of how smell and taste already can integrate and lead to things like threshold enhancement. I don't want to give away the story here, but we have a study from Dalton in 2000, and in this study, the researchers were investigating how does taste influence smell, orthonasal smell detection. So they had people smell through the nose, orthonasally, benzaldehyde, which is a chemical that smells like cherries. So first, they had people just smell different concentrations of benzaldehyde to find out the threshold concentration at which they can detect benzaldehyde. Then they had people put some taste solutions in the mouth and smell the benzaldehyde again to determine the new threshold, which was determined with some taste solutions in the mouth. So you can see that on the y-axis we have the difference in sensitivity from the purely orthonasal condition versus orthonasal plus taste. So the benzene alone is kind of like a replication study where you don't have anything in the mouth, and here you see almost no change. And in the second time, when people held either water or MSG solution in the mouth, we actually had a decrease in sensitivity to benzaldehyde. And again, this is a cherry aroma that people are detecting. So here's a short question for those of you in the audience. They also had a condition where people had to smell benzaldehyde again, but this time they held something sweet in their mouth. So what do you think happened to their threshold?
Well, it had to go up very high because otherwise they wouldn't have made the figure like this, right?
Yes, that's the clever answer, and exactly that's what happened. So if you think about cherry aroma, we tend to associate cherry aroma with sweetness. When you had this smell threshold test again while you were tasting sweetness, that actually enhanced your smell threshold. So now we're going to move on to the first chocolate tasting. So please only eat one of the chocolate chips. And those of you at home, if you have chocolate, you can feel free to take a bite of the chocolate. But what I want you to do is I want you to put the chocolate in the mouth and then pinch your nose while you're chewing it. And what you should be perceiving right now is only sweetness and bitterness and maybe some waxy texture. Now, unpinch your nose. And now, hopefully, because I don't have chocolate here, you should all of a sudden get this chocolate flavor. So that's... And now here's a question. Where do you perceive the chocolate flavor that you just suddenly got? Where is it coming from?
It feels as if it comes from the mouth.
Yeah, from the tongue, yeah.
From the tongue. Very good. Thank you for saying that. But it's weird, right? Because smell is detected in the nose, like I said. We have no smell detectors in the tongue. But it feels like it's coming from the tongue. And this... Oh, sorry about my Zoom thing here. This is called oral referral. And it's kind of like the classic ventriloquist effect in audiovisual research, where you have, you know, because you see the mouth moving, you think the voice is coming from the puppet instead of the person. And this is a bit of what's happening here, because while we are detecting the smell in the nose, not in the mouth, because we have this food that is in the mouth, and in fact we can feel the texture, the chocolate, and it's this touch that's capturing our attention of the smell into the mouth. And I will very briefly talk about the fact that oral referral actually, again, depends on how congruent the smell and taste is. So here you felt the chocolate in the mouth because you tasted sweet and bitter, and you know that chocolate aroma comes in the mouth. Now, had I been really clever and I made like a chicken flavored chocolate where it would have chicken aromas but still taste sweet and bitter, you would have gotten a very different experience where you would have been better able to detect the smell in the nose but the taste in the mouth, like this reverse sensation. And that's what this study is showing. In the study, it looks a little bit weird. I want to explain. They were testing people in terms of perceiving both taste and retronasal olfaction in the mouth, but separately. So here you have this jar where there's liquid on the bottom that's being stirred, and people are sucking in only aromas through the straw. This way they're able to get retronasal, olfaction, but in the mouth. At the same time, the experimenter is putting some flavored solutions in this eyedropper, and the eyedropper is going in the mouth, so that people are perceiving taste and retronasal olfaction separately in the mouth in this very strange setting. And the participants were asked, exactly like what I asked you, where do you get the aroma? Where do you get the flavor? Sorry, where do you get the flavor? Is it in the nose, in the oral cavity, or on the tongue? And just very quickly, you can see that when the vanilla aroma was administered in this straw device, it was only when people also tasted sugar that they detected this flavor to be on the tongue, just like what you guys said. But when they tasted acid, for example, because acid and vanilla are very different and incongruent, they still perceived the vanilla on the nose was the acid on the tongue, so this differentiation. And all that is to say that sensory integration is very dependent on our expectations and our cultural learnings of what things are congruent and what are not. Okay, now let's talk about other kinds of flavor illusions. And I'm really a big fan of Donald Hoffman, so I really want to show this quote: "Our perceptions of the world don't depend entirely on physical features of the things that we see, hear, feel, touch, and taste. The reality we experience also depends on the capabilities, limitations, and inherent characteristics of our sensory and perceptual systems." Now, I know that a lot of you probably study things from a perceptual coding framework, and this, of course, makes obvious sense. But the reason why I always have this slide in my talks is most food scientists, for example, still have this perhaps old-fashioned view of the world where the human acts like an analytical machine, that we respond purely to stimuli. And I always have to convince people who work in food science that no, it's not just about us reacting to the environment or the food. It's really about how our expectations and our memory and our history will then inform the way we perceive the food. And that's basically what I have here. So I want to talk about different kinds of illusions that can happen when it comes to food. So first I want to show some very basic visual illusions, and I call these illusions of decision making. For example, which animal is closer to the hunter? This is a decision we have to make, which one is closer. And if you ask most people in Western societies, they will say that the deer is closer to the elephant because we have this notion of straight lines meeting in perspective. Whereas if there's been studies showing that if you ask people the same question, but maybe indigenous tribes of people who are used to living in a jungle, for example, where there are not so many straight lines, they will say that in fact the elephant is closer because it is physically closer. Another example of this kind of illusion are the two monsters chasing each other. If I were to ask you which one is bigger, which one would you say is bigger? The one in the back, even though they're the same size. Because again, we have this, we know about perspective. So we're able to use this prior knowledge to shape the way that we make decisions about which one is closer. Well, we also have this kind of illusions when it comes to smell and taste. So in this study, participants were presented with a specific smell, and they were told either that this is the smell of cheese or this is the smell of sweat, even though it is the same smell. And what the researchers found, maybe to nobody's surprise, is that when the same smell was labeled as cheese, people thought it was okay, but when the same smell was labeled as body odor, people really, really didn't like it. And this was also reflected in the fMRI activations. So for me, this is kind of a similar type of illusion to the decision illusion that we saw earlier, because these word labels are forming the context, and that will actually change the way we perceive the stimuli. Here's a restaurant example. This is a dish from the Fat Duck, which is a 3 Michelin star restaurant in the UK. And this is a dish called beetroot and orange. And it's served on the plate like that. And probably most people would think, oh, the red one must be the beet, and the yellow one must be the orange. And when they're actually eating the dish, they get a big surprise, because in fact, this is a dish that's made from golden beets and blood orange. So I really like this example of how chefs can play with people's expectations and decisions in real life. Here's the third example, which is maybe more surprising, the kind of expectations we build just on the weight of cutlery. So this was a study that was done at Oxford in Charles Spence's college. So in this case, this was a dinner for parents of students, and they divided the people who sat in this dinner into 2 groups. One group got heavier cutlery than the other group, but the food was the same. And they had to answer a questionnaire about what they thought of the food. And what they found here was that the people who had the heavier cutlery, but the same food, were willing to pay more for the food and thought the food was more artistic, even though it's exactly the same. So I thought this is a good example of a decision illusion, where in this case, where our frame of thinking is biased by just the weight of the cutlery. And by the way, the Fat Duck restaurant that I showed earlier apparently has the most heavy utensils of all the restaurants in the UK. Just FYI. And now I want to talk about some examples of perceptual illusions. Someone can try to count the number of white and black dots in this drawing. And I think this kind of illusions also happen when we're talking about taste and flavor. And because I like wine, I like to do wine studies. And I want to talk about the importance of wine color and what I call smell hallucinations that's caused by different colors in wine. So a few years ago, I was in Barcelona, here, and I helped to organize a symposium on wine, the brain and wine. And as part of this symposium, we made all 200-something attendants do a bunch of experiments. Well, they involved wine. So in one of the experiments, I got 3 wines. Well, actually, no, I got 2 wines. One was a rosé, one was a white wine, and the third wine was the white wine that I added some red food coloring onto to make it rosé colored. So it looked something like that. And I had everyone do a task, which is for each wine, they had to first smell the wine, then they had to write down 5 descriptors that they perceived from the smell. And these could be anything, so it was a free choice kind of situation. And then they tasted the wine, and they had to write down 5 descriptors on how the wine tasted like. Sorry, what the flavor was. And of course the order was randomized, so some people started with the white, some people started with the real rosé, and some people started with the fake rosé. And what I did was that I looked at which kind of categories of smell and flavor these wines fell into. So for example, the categories were floral, white fruit, citrus, stone fruit, tropical fruit, red and black fruit. And I know this is maybe a lot of data, so this was the data from the flavor of the white wine, the rosé wine, and the fake rosé wine. And because we had something like 220 people, and because this was a wine and neuroscience conference, most of the people we got actually worked in the wine trade. So these are what I called experts with at least 5 years of experience. We also had some people that I labeled intermediates. These were people who didn't work in the wine trade per se, but had either gone to formal wine classes or had gone to formal wine tastings. And then we had something like 30 or 40 people who just only drank wine in a casual way. And the really interesting results I found from this study is that, in a way, it was only the intermediates and experts, people who had experience with wine tasting, who you can say confused the real rosé and the fake rosé. Because here you can say that they came up with a lot of these kind of red fruit descriptors for the fake rosé wine, and you can compare this was the white and this was the rosé, the fake rosé. These two should have been the same, but in fact you can see a big difference. And to be honest, when I came to the beginners, all these 3 were not significantly different because beginners just can mix words all over the place and they have very little consistency. Now, I think there are different ways of interpreting this result, because some people might just say, oh, wine experts don't know anything and they can't tell red from white or white from rosé, and it's all biased. And actually, I would argue that what happened in this case with the wine experts is that they actually smelled and perceived these red fruit aromas in the glass. Because in a way, it's based on our expectations and mental imagery. So I would actually love to put some wine experts in IMRI and give them wines of different colors. And of course, I don't know if you can actually see differences, and maybe you can see differences in what kind of smells you're perceiving. Anyways, I'm going slightly ahead of myself, but I found this result extremely interesting. And moving on from vision to sound, because in a way, this is what I spent a lot of my PhD researching, and it's also, I'm still continuing to do research in this area, and this is what I call sonic seasoning. So how sound can perhaps change the way we perceive flavor. And now we're going to do more chocolate tasting. So the way it's going to work now is I have 2 soundtracks that are about 40 seconds long. And those of you at home, if you have some chocolate with you, you can do this. And of course, now you know that they're all the same chocolate, so saying that now. So when I play the first soundtrack, I want you to eat 1 piece of chocolate. And then when I play the second soundtrack, I want you to eat the other chocolate and notice any differences. So here we go. Here's the first sound. Okay, so that was the first chocolate. Please have some water to rinse your mouth. All right, and now, oh, okay. I will allot time for people to get some water.
Thank you very much.
A bit like eating medicine. Okay, so now I'm going to put on the second piece of music, which is again going to be about 40 seconds. And I should say that these music were created by one of my other PhD students, Sina Mathisen, who did her master's in musicology, and she very usefully can be used to compose these soundtracks. All right, here's soundtrack number 2.
You timed this for the sun to come out.
Yeah, so now I both have the effect of brightness and also the effect of music. And this is always like the moment of truth when I ask people, so how did it feel?
The first was more bitter and the second was more sweet.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm really surprised at how strong the effect is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe it was the sun.
Yes.
But the taste was also stronger for me in the second.
Me too.
Generally.
For me, it was the other way around.
Okay.
You mean the first one was stronger than the second?
Yeah.
In terms of intensity?
In terms of intensity and kind of, I got more of a dark, dusty, I guess,
Mhm.
feeling in the first one,
Mhm.
and then the
Mhm.
second one was just kind of lighter.
Yep.
I think the mouthfeel felt a bit different. The
Oh.
second one was more soft
Mhm.
around the mouth, and the first one felt more sharp, kind of. Yeah.
Great. Because
just the
Frank there, we have a study planned on chocolate and mouthfeel, so this is very good, good input. Okay, so thank you all for saying the differences, and I feel like once again my PhD work is validated. So to explain why the sounds might influence our taste experience, we have to go back to this key notion of cross-modal correspondences, which Frank has heard over and over again. So, if you remember, the lab where I did my PhD was called the Cross-Modal Research Lab, because we focus a lot of attention on these cross-modal correspondences, which are the often very surprising associations that people will make between seemingly unrelated attributes of different sensory modalities. So this is the most famous example, the so-called By Qian effect. So we have two shapes here, one is round, one is angular. Now if I ask you, which one is Kiki? Which shape is Kiki? What would you say?
Angular one.
Do everyone agree that the angular is Kiki and the round is Buba? Yeah, so does everyone else that this has ever been studied. And this effect has been replicated both with verbally saying the words and also looking at the letters, because you can argue that Kiki in English at least looks very angular. Okay, and I like to quiz people, so here are some questions for you guys. These are a table of sound taste correspondences that has been found to date, and we're always doing new research to find more of these correspondences. And let's focus on tempo. This is the speed, basically fast or slow. For example, we have found that sweet tends to be associated with slow, salty is kind of average. But what about bitter and sour? I will give you a hint that one is slow and one is fast. So which one do you feel like is the fast one?
Sour.
Sour.
like again, you know, the definition of cross-modal correspondences are these kind of surprising things that somehow people do generally agree upon. And exactly, sour is fast and bitter tends to be slow. Okay, one more try. So pitch, this is the frequency, whether it's high or low. I'm already making a cross-modal correspondence between elevation and sound. But here again, sour people very clearly associate with high pitch. Salty again is a bit tricky, it's in the middle. Now my question is, what about bitter and sweet? And once again, I will say one is high and one is low.
Peter is low.
Do everyone else agree?
No.
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 I would say sweet is low.
Yeah.
Bitter high.
Oh, okay.
Me too.
So we have a descent table over here. And everyone else agrees with Andreas?
I would also say sweet is low. Yeah, me too.
Whew.
Oh, God.
So let me, I will just add to something. So this is on average what has been found. And you know, I have done, it's not, I mean, this is not, no one is right or wrong, right? This is just general tendencies. And I will just say one thing before I come to your question. And that is, there are many different ways that people have derived these correspondences. So for example, I had done a study in the lab where I gave people these little cups of taste solutions. They were all clear, so there were no color cues. I had people taste the solutions, and then they had a little keyboard in front of them, and they had to pick a key on the keyboard that best matched. And these taste solutions were things like sucrose, citric acid, kind of very basic tastes. I would imagine, for example, if you had imagined things like caramel, or like a chocolate cake, that might give you different associations with pitch. But yes, question.
Yeah, you kind of answered, but I was wondering how this came out of research, whether this is something that emerges from natural everyday language or something that comes out of these forced choice scenarios. Because I gotta say, when you asked me about this,
Yeah.
I had to force myself to make a choice, but it didn't make sense to me at all. I didn't think of it as either high or low. Okay, if I had to pick one, I would do that. So is this always kind of forced choice or clavicures or stuff like that?
Yes, well, it depends. Because there's been many studies. You know, the one that I mentioned, I went from taste to sound. And you know, in the beginning, the very earliest research was, you know, listen to these sounds and then force choice four or five words of the basic taste words, which one does the best match. But there's been also studies, for example, my collaborator, Bruno Mez in Argentina, he had musicians come to the lab and they had to improvise music based on a cue word. For example, sweet music or sour music, and then he analyzed the auditory parameters that came out that way. So there's been kind of many approaches and different ways of approaching it. And we should keep in mind that this table is kind of like a guidance for researchers or composers to either compose music. So for example, the chocolate music that you heard was made by my PhD student. But you can also use these as guidance to find existing pieces of music that, you know, based on these features might predict how people would associate. And to go one step further, how this might influence at least the flavor experience, shall we say? I'm very careful to not say the word perception, because is it actually perception or is it evaluation? We'll get there. But in 2012, this was the first study that looked at bitter or sweet soundtracks that were listened to while people were tasting this bittersweet candy. And there the researchers found not a very big but significant effect of the balance of sweet and bitterness of this very complex food. And here I have a brief diagram of kind of the core of my PhD thesis, actually, because I was looking at the different mechanisms which might be able to explain this sonic seasoning, say, illusion that you just experienced. And I want to draw your attention to this timeline on the bottom, because if we think about how sound can influence taste, you can break down the influence into hearing the music before tasting, during tasting, or even after tasting. And that is because there are different mechanisms. If you hear the music before tasting, and that could change our expectations of the food, which then can change the actual perception of the food. While you're listening to the music and eating at the same time, this could be due to emotion mediation. The music makes me feel happy or sad, and that in turn changes how I taste. It could be that the music is drawing my attention to different aspects of the taste. Or it could be just like a pure physiological response, and I have an example to show this. Where, for example, maybe listening to a sour music makes my mouth salivate, and I have this embodied cognition effect where I know if I'm salivating, that's because something is sour. And of course, the critique I've heard many times is that maybe this is just a response bias. People are just drawing the line, if they have to rate how sweet something is. Hearing the music just makes them change where they draw the line, but nothing to do with the mouth. So I want to show a few examples. I know I'm not running so fast on time, so I will quickly go through some studies. Most of these have been published, so you can just go look at them yourself. That has been conducted that probe at these different mechanisms of how the sonic seasoning effect comes to be. This is probably one of the favorite studies I conducted because I just literally gave people chocolate, like what you just experienced, but I manipulated when they heard the music. And you can see that we have this before group where people heard music for 30 seconds, tasted chocolate, cleaned their mouth, made their rating. And then we had this during group where they heard the music and tasted at the same time, kind of like what you guys did. And I also had a group that tasted the chocolate, rinsed their mouth, and then listened to the music while they made the rating at the same time.
Why did they have to cleanse their mouth?
So that when we get to this stage, it's not that the music is influencing the residual taste in the mouth. Because if the music is influencing some residual taste, you might still be in this state. So I wanted to very clearly separate what was in the mouth.
Okay.
And what we found from this study, and again we have this judgment of how balanced the chocolate was between sweet and bitter, and these were 70% chocolate. And most of my experiments were done with this kind of semi-sweet chocolates, because like most illusions, it works best when we're eating a food or a drink that is quite complex, where there's a high degree of ambiguity, where we really need other sensory modalities to help us make sense of the food. So first, if we take the dream group, these are the people who did it like you guys. They heard the music and tasted at the same time. And maybe not so surprising, in both cases we had this replication of the bitter music made the chocolate taste more bitter than sweet, and the sweet music made the sweetness go a bit higher. What is also interesting is that in the group that heard the music and then ate the chocolate, we also had the sonic seasoning effect, which points to this expectations mechanism. Oh, sorry, and finally, we didn't, at least here, notice a significant effect when the people heard the music and made the rating at the same time. And I wanted to show this mediation analysis very quickly because I also tried to probe whether there was an emotion mediation effect of music liking. And just very shortly, there was a mediation effect of music liking, basically mediating how much the music influenced how much people like the food. And I just wanted to get to this graph, which showed that according to that study, we did find evidence of sensory expectations of the music. We found evidence of emotion mediation, but we didn't see any evidence of response bias. Yes?
Yeah, really
Anna.
interesting. I don't know a lot about the chemistry of food, but it's possible to make flavor change over time, right? So you could have like a dynamic, like something that starts out
Yep.
sweet and then becomes sour. Has anyone tried to time lock
Yes.
sour? The
Yes.
evolution of sour?
I have two
Yeah,
papers.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I have one paper where we played people this very strange hybrid music that was, if I remember correctly, first 15 seconds was sweet, and then you just switched to sour, and also vice versa, so sour first and sweet. And then we had people hold a sweet and sour solution in the mouth, and they had to make what's so-called temporal intensity assessments. So every moment in time they had to rate how sweet something was, or every moment in time they had to rate how sour it was. And we could see this clear effect of music, that when the music changed, the sweet or sour perception also changed. We also have a similar study with wine and music, and this was looking at which component, which flavor in the wine was most dominant, and we kind of did a temporal analysis of both music parameter changes and flavor parameter changes and how they go with each other. So yes. Moving on, I really like this study, even though I had to collect saliva from people, which was less fun. But this was probing the physiological path to see if sour music makes people salivate. Here's 5 seconds of sour music. Enjoy. So I don't know if that made anybody salivate. And in this study, we actually didn't find an effect because we had 3 conditions. Either people sat there in silence, we just measured how much they salivated, listened to the soundtrack, or they had to watch a video of someone eating a lemon, because it's been shown very reliably that we will salivate looking at someone eat a lemon. So here we did validate the lemon video effect, but we didn't happen to find the effect of the music. But what we were thinking about is what would happen if you combine the video and the sour soundtrack together. Maybe that would even heighten the salivation. I didn't get to do it, but it's a fun study. And finally, I just want to show some more recent study that was conducted. Well, actually, the timing one was also after I came here. But one of my PhD students, Danny Lee, his PhD is all about how background music influences our decision making. And many of his studies had this eye tracking paradigm where people had to look at these menu cards with 4 different food items, while there were different kinds of background music playing. So in this case, people either listened to no music or sweet soundtrack or salty soundtrack throughout the block with these food choices. And what he found, maybe not surprisingly in this case, is that playing the sweet music versus the salty music made people choose sweet versus salty music more often, and also they looked more at the sweet foods compared to the salty foods when the sweet music is playing, and vice versa. And I know that was very fast, but just to say that these kind of eye tracking studies, for me at least, shows evidence of this attention capture mechanism between sound and flavor. And something that we just finished data collection for is I kept on talking about is actually perception. Well, we don't know. So we did an MRI study. And this was part of the Carlsberg project, because there's some previous research showing that, for example, even reading the word salt will activate the gustatory brain region that is corresponding to taste. And we ran this study in Skyview in July and also in September. So in this setup, we had sweet and sour music playing while participants were tasting sweet and sour conditions in the scanner. And we tested this in 3 blocks where they either had combinations of sweet music and sour music and sweet taste and sour taste, both congruent and incongruent. And then we had a condition where they only listened to the soundtracks and a condition where they only had taste. And of course, the order for these 2 were randomized. Yes, this took a lot of time and a lot of work, because running 12 meters of silicone tubes from the machine room to the scanning room is not very fun. I don't have any results to show you at the moment because my postdocs are both on maternity leave. But I'm really, really excited about this because I've wanted to do a study like this since I was doing my PhD, and finally we got a chance to run this. Okay, very quick summary of what I've talked about so far. Flavor is multisensory integration for me at its finest. These kind of illusions are really the norm and not the exception, and we perceive the world in a way that optimizes evolutionary fitness. This is a bit of a general statement, but for example, all the integration effects we see with sugar and vanilla, for example, when we smell vanilla, we tend to think sweetness. in a way that help us maximize energy from the food. And now finally I want to talk a little bit about something different, and this is the extended reality work that I have been doing. So Frank is also here. Earlier this year we wrote a review paper on how people in sensory and consumer science can get started with virtual reality. So in here we both wanted to do like a hands-on guide for when you want to do a VR study. What kind of things do you have to think about? What are the hardware, software options? What have people in the last 5 years done so far? And also some thoughts on how this field can advance both in the short term and in the long term. Let's see how much time I have. So very quickly, I want to talk about the way we categorize extended reality experiences. So on the left, we have physical reality, like what we have now. On the right, we have true virtual reality. Virtual reality, for example, if you are drinking beer at a bar, here would be you're at the bar drinking the beer. On the right, you're just sitting in VR looking at a bar with a beer, but everything's virtual. And then in the middle, we have the most interesting part, which is mixed reality. So augmented reality, many people are familiar with. This is, for example, if you're at a bar and you're drinking a beer and you have an app, you look at the beer with the camera on the phone and it tells you some information about where the beer was made, what is the philosophy of the producer, etc. And then we have this, perhaps the most interesting case, augmented virtuality, where I can be sitting in the lab with VR headsets on. I see that I'm at a pub, but I am also drinking a beer in real life, and I can somehow integrate the digital and the virtual. So here's an example of this in action. This is a paper we published in 2019 or 2020. So here you can see, this is me. I'm holding a coffee. Because we have a VR tracker on the bottom of the cup, I can both touch and drink the coffee in real life, and I can also see the coffee in the virtual reality. And in this case, we gave people black coffee to drink, but half the time they saw it as dark brown, half the time they saw it as light brown. And we asked people to report the sweetness, bitterness, and creaminess of the coffee. And very quickly, what the major result we found was that when the coffee was at this low sugar level, so quite bitter, people thought the coffee was more creamy when the color was lighter than darker. Again, maybe not surprising at all. But this study would be quite hard to do in real life if you want to give people black coffee that looks light brown without changing anything else about the coffee. So this was an example of me using virtual reality as a way to study multisensory integration by having this hybrid real versus physical example. Here's another study that was one of my master's students' project, where we had the same setup with the coffee, but in this time I didn't change anything about the color of the coffee. What we changed was the background color and music. So, for example, in this case, this was a preferred color with a preferred music. Oh, sorry. And then here was a disliked color with a disliked music. The music came from a music library of these kind of emotion associations. And maybe not very surprisingly, what we found in this case was that when you drank the coffee in an environment that you preferred, the coffee was liked more, kind of obviously, but also it was judged to be sweeter compared to the coffee in the unliked case. Almost done. Actually, Frank is everywhere. It's a good thing that he's here. I wanted to show this as kind of a different example. Here is using augmented reality, which I think is really exciting for doing consumer studies. This was the Aarhus Food Week that happened in August. We gave people mealworms to taste. For half of the groups, we gave them a brochure on global warming and why plant-based foods is better for the environment, and then we had them taste the mealworms. In the other group, we gave them the brochure, and then we had them use the Snapchat lens that I had made. This is kind of like we call this apocalypse lens. Basically, what would happen if global warming got worse in 50 years. So I added wrinkles on the person's face, and also there was smoke and fire, and everything looked kind of yellow. Because I'm very curious to see if augmented reality can be a way to change people's mindsets. So.
And you can download the lens if you want. If you have Snapchat, just scan it.
I just wanted to show this because it's such a fun example.
It was.
Yeah, I think this is where the Media Lab background comes in. I just like to play with things. Frank is really everywhere. And I just wanted to show this as kind of a next step thought process. This is a paper that we just published on impossible experiences in extended reality. And I just have to show my beautiful unicorn model because we introduced a way for people to think about how to design impossible experiences. And the way we organized this was on two axes. One is going from reality to fantasy in terms of the elements, and the other axis is going from the laws of physics on Earth versus other laws. So you can kind of think about it in terms of like nouns and verbs. So for example, in the first quadrant, we have a real horse that's walking on the ground. In the second quadrant, we still have a real horse, but the horse is flying. In the third quadrant, we have a unicorn, but the unicorn is walking around, obeying the laws of physics. And in the fourth quadrant, we have a unicorn that's flying. And this might sound a little bit silly, and I really just want to show my beautiful artwork. But in this paper, we discussed this framework for getting people to think about how we can design different kinds of impossible experiences. And the reason why we want to do this is because with the advent of extended reality technology, it's actually quite easy now to create these experiences. And what might the ramifications be of changing people's mindsets based on these novel experiences? So some final thoughts. I'm kind of happy that the Carlsberg Foundation isn't here to see how I'm taking this augmented and virtual flavor and moving into different directions. But some things I'm interested in is how does our perception also mirror our internal state? What are the implications of these kinds of flavor illusions on physiology and metabolism, how we actually process the food? And this is a very Media Lab one, how do we extend the human sensorium with extended reality? And thank you for your attention.